summary, India resembles in some important dimensions the vulnerabilities of countries that experience sovereign defaults or near defaults. Later, the paper went on to say India may be as vulnerable to a financing crisis as some other economies that have experienced severe financial turmoil. So, true to his reputation, he was at the time predicting a crisis in India. I was his commentator and was on the opposite side and argued that at least in the next 5 years there's going to be no crisis. I'm very pleased that in a rare event I turned out to be right on that one. But now Professor Roubini actually is almost on the opposite side of his position in 2004. In Davos, he is reported to have said that India is today in a sweet spot. So I'll begin by, let's say, asking him how he sees India in a sweet spot today, and we'll carry on the conversation from there on.
Well, I would say that, for the last 20, 25 years, India has gone through a variety of economic cycles, both macro and structural. Some significant reforms started in the early 1990s following a balance of payment crisis. And around the mid-2000s, I was worried about the fact that India was another period of time where there were significantly larger fiscal and current account deficits. And unless those situation was being addressed, that would have led to financial stresses. And things improved since then, but then in the early 2000s, in the early part of this decade, we had also another period of time where twin deficit emerged. As late as 2 years ago, India had this twin fiscal and current account deficit, and it was put together among the fragile five: India, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, all countries that had twin current account and fiscal deficits, that had rising inflation, falling economic growth, and a number of financial fragilities. I think that period of time was a period in which there was an alert coming from the taper tantrum in the United States that induced policymakers to make changes, those that had loose macroeconomic policy, easy monetary policy, easy credit policy, easy fiscal policy. In the meanwhile, there was also change in government in India in the last year and a half. And well, there is a lot of talk about, but on the macroeconomic side, I think two things have changed. One is that there has been a monetary tightening, and therefore the concerns about easy monetary policy feeding inflation and leading to further depreciation have been controlled. And if anything, inflation is on the way down. That's important. Secondly, there's been also a meaningful process of fiscal adjustment, reduction of the budget deficit that was too large. Of course, India has been also partially lucky because the fall in oil, energy, commodity prices for a commodity importing country like India has benefited both the external balance of the country, the current account, and also the fiscal balances of the government. But you have to be giving credit to the government that have taken also fiscal action, such as, for example, reducing a variety of subsidies in the economy that also helped the reduction. So 2 years ago, India had significant macroeconomic imbalances, both internal and external balance. Those things have been reduced so far, and therefore those kind of vulnerability have been reduced. Of course, we'll have a chance to talk about the structural reform to increase potential growth in India. But I would say having the sound macroeconomic policy and today both monetary, credit, and fiscal policy and in the right direction is important because that's a precondition, macroeconomic stability, for then doing all the other things that lead to potential large economic growth.
Yeah, so if you were here 2 years ago, you'd be hearing about India staring in the face of a crisis?
No, even at that time, I didn't say that the crisis will occur. Most people identified a number of countries that had these macroeconomic imbalances. Those macroeconomic imbalances were, adjustable, but I'd say nothing is deterministic. 2 years ago, there were 5 countries that were in a period of fragility. One of them, among others, India, did more macro adjustment, both monetary and fiscal. Right now is in a better position. Another country, like, for example, Brazil, instead, has not done major fiscal adjustment, has been down the path of ever larger fiscal deficits, increasing public debt, and now the risk of a downgrade, significant free fall of the currency, and economic, political, and financial turmoil. So I think whatever the initial conditions are, what matters is then whether aggressive and credible policy action is taken to remedy imbalances that can be in an economy. India made those adjustments. There's been a change in government and has gone in the right direction.
So tell us a little bit, one of the things that seems not to be going too well is the exports. So to give a little background, obviously the export slowdown has happened globally. Total value of exports rose about 2.5% in the last year. Yet India actually had a much greater decline in exports. It not only did not rise, but nearly 15% decline in exports. Would you have some sort of explanation why India in particular got hit particularly hard on that front, and what India could possibly be doing to revive at least that part of the Indian economy? Otherwise is in good shape. It's growing at about 7.5%. Predicted to continue to stay there and perhaps accelerate. But there is a little bit of worry on the export front.
Yeah, I would say there are several factors that explain what has been going on, and I would like to hear also your views on that. After I have mine, you might have a different angle on it. First of all, global growth has been slowing down, and for reasons we can discuss, the growth of global trade has been slowing down even faster than economic growth. It doesn't look like it's strong as in the past. Now, this is something that affects every country in the world, not just India. But that's a reason behind the slowdown of export growth. Now, if export growth in India has fallen more than other countries, you have to explain that differential. Then the second factor is that many currencies around the world have fallen in value, especially in emerging markets. But in relative terms, I would say that probably other currencies in emerging markets have fallen in value more than the Indian rupee. In part because, of course, the external domestic balance of India is better. India has been benefiting from the fall in commodity prices that led to an improvement of the external balance of the country. But there are other currencies have fallen 30, 40, 50, 60% and more. Therefore, in relative terms, I would say the Indian currency has been appreciating relative to at least some of the DM currencies. Three, what's happening is that not only the Chinese currency is gradually and only gradually falling in value, but most importantly, in China, there is a massive excess capacity in steel, in cement, glass plates, aluminum, in a variety of industrial and manufactured goods. And the deflationary impact of China is not just on commodity prices. They're literally exporting, some people say dumping, this excess capacity to other parts of the world. So there has been a surge, for example, of exports of China, of, say, steel to Europe, United States, but also to India. There's been a significant increase in Indian imports of, say, Chinese goods in a wide range of activities. And therefore, that competitive pressure coming from a glut of capacity in China being essentially exported to India, also the third market in which India might have actually competition with India, might be explaining why the export performance of India has been disappointing even compared to the one of other emerging market economies. But I would like to take your view on that and see whether there's other factors explain it.
I totally agree with you. The key reason why India's exports actually declined about 15% compared to about 2.5% expansion in the global exports is that India's currency actually has appreciated relative to many of the countries. With respect to the US, in real terms, it has been largely flat, but relative to the other countries, it has appreciated. And China factor is clearly an important one because a lot of excess capacity. So it is not merely an issue of India not being able to export to China, but also not able to export against China in third markets.
Third market, yeah.
So I think that has been clearly.
And of course, there's also import competition in domestic Indian markets, right?
That also.
Import competing sector are competing now with Chinese goods as well.
Right. No, that too, although that's more on the import side,
import side,
competing side. So you heard the Prime Minister yesterday. Any thoughts on what he said? Well,
he's certainly a very thoughtful leader. He's a visionary. He presented a very broad agenda for what he wants to do and what he has already done, both accomplishment and what needs to be done. So I think that having a leader that knows how to change this country and this economy in the right direction is important. And I think that that strong leadership is there. I think that everybody recognizes that there is a list of reforms that have been made, another list of reforms that are in the pipeline but have not yet implemented. There are, of course, legislator constraints of one sort or another, because some things have to be passed by, say, the upper house, where there is not maybe yet a majority, like the GST reform. There are other things that have to be done through regulation and so on. And of course, in a large country like India, change takes time. There is vested interests that are maybe against change. There are, political economy of reform that is hard, and so on and so on. So I think that my assessment is that the first derivative of reform is positive, meaning they're going the right direction. Maybe the second derivative, the speed, is not accelerating. Maybe there's been even some concern that it's becoming increasingly difficult to do some of the reforms that need to be done. And prime example is how the GST reform has been stalled so far.
I think the GST reform will eventually happen, even though we have hit perhaps a little bit of a roadblock currently. My own view is that this is something that actually has had support from both sides. The original reform really originated in the first NDA government. Then it was actually picked up in a much bigger way by the previous UPA government. So the Congress party has generally been behind this reform also. Now there is some disagreement, but I think, as we go forward, this is going to be smoothed out, and the reform will come into play. But there is a lot of talk about other reforms in other areas for the simplifications. The finance minister in the last year's budget had announced that he was going to go forward with the reform of the corporate profit taxes also. Currently lots of exemptions, and the rate is very high, although the collection rate on corporate profit tax is only 23-24%. The actual rate of taxation, particularly when you also figure out all the surcharges and cesses, it's about 34%. So that he wants to bring down to 25%. That's one thing. Another area of reform, very important one, I've been arguing for a long time, that India needs a modern bankruptcy law, which was also announced by the finance minister last year, which is in the pipeline. So hopefully that will be carried out this year. Yep. So I think we should see a slew of reforms continuing. And let's see, we hope that the second derivative would turn positive also. So that's where we are headed. Now, you have been generally, particularly a specialist on international capital flows. Yeah. And I wonder if you can enlighten us how you assess India on that front. Is it going too fast, too slow? What should it be doing as next steps?
Well, I think that opening up of the economy is not just opening up to trade and actually controlling for the size of the country. The degree of openness now to exports and imports of India is quite large, even larger than one of relatively big economies like the United States and so on. So that trade openness is increasing significantly. I think that on the side of capital account liberalization, India has been more cautious for a number of reasons, including bond inflows. I think there is still an element of financial repression. The requirements of liquidity that are imposed on the banking systems are a way of, cheaply financing some of the fiscal deficits of the government. And that's why there are still constraints to inflows of bond and fixed income instruments. That process of liberalization is still very gradual. There has been much more liberalization of portfolio inflows and so on. I would say in this respect, the key thing for India is to try to attract as much as possible long-term stable equity forms of investment in the country, including foreign direct investment. Liberalization is still ongoing. More needs to be done. I would say that, interestingly enough, I was recently again in China, and one of the reasons the Chinese wanted to maintain their growth rate closer to 7% rather than lower, I was asking why it's so important for you, apart from prestige. was the argument they made. They said in the last 30 years, growth in China has been faster than India, and we have been receiving so much more inward FDI in China relative to India. Their concern is that if Chinese growth as it is slowing down towards 6% or 5%, while the one of India is already 7% and growing, then the investor attention is going to go towards India rather than China. And inflows of FDI are actually beneficial, not just as a form of capital, but the inflow of knowledge, managerial skills, and you name it. But, India has to make much more effort to make sure that actually, foreign direct investment has been welcome. I think that one of the sore points has been this question of retroactive taxation, and all the government is working on a solution on that issue. As we know, FDI is attracted by having a situation of transparency where the rules of game are clear, and therefore any kind of ex post change in taxation is something that is not beneficial for foreign direct investment. So I would say, I would stress everything can be done in terms of policy that attracts significant amounts of foreign direct investment over other types of capital.
Good. So let me pick up a little bit on the China story, since you have touched on it. Now, one view here is that as China slows down, and the twin facts that the wages in China have been rising, and demographically the supply of labor is declining and will continue to decline in China, that perhaps some of the industries in China, particularly the labor-intensive industries, would begin to move out. Some of that movement is beginning to happen. Now, the million-dollar question is, where is this industry going to go if it is going to go out of China? One possibility is that it will come to India. This is a sort of optimistic view, optimistic side of it. Pessimistic side is that it will go to maybe countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc. How do you view this movement, if you at all think that that kind of movement is going to occur in the years to come?
I do believe it's going to occur, and it's already occurring. China is moving up into the value-added chain of production, and certainly more traditional, labor-intensive, lower value-added production is becoming too expensive, as now there has been significant wage growth relative to productivity in China. And some of it is moving to other parts of Asia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and so on. I think that a lot of it can be moving to India, because India has the advantage, and in addition to having relatively low labor costs, it also has a very large domestic market. So if you're producing in India, you can produce for the domestic market, you can produce also for global markets. And that's one of the benefits. I mean, we've seen, for example, a major Taiwanese consumer electronic company, Foxconn, that employs more than 1 million people in China, saying in the next decade they want to essentially move to robotics, automation for their production in China, but they want to move in a place like India. And they already made a commitment. I would say the cost of labor in India is still low enough that it actually makes sense to have less capital-intensive and more labor-intensive forms of production. I think that many of these firms that are coming to India are concerned about a few things, however. One is, as I said, the regulatory tax framework and so on. Secondly, you need really good infrastructure, because without good infrastructure, doing production and exporting, logistics, and all the other things are key. China has done a lot. India is in the process of doing a lot, but that work has to be done. We know that also in India, cost of acquiring land is complicated for a whole bunch of things, and this land reform probably is not going to pass at the national level. And we also know that in India, probably labor markets are more rigid, and hiring costs are also greater. And probably, again, at the central level, doing a labor reform is going to be difficult. I think that maybe the hope is that the process of reform is going to occur more at the state level. That on things like land policy or labor and so on, the states in India have a significant amount of autonomy, and if some changes in legislations are not going to happen at the central level, the competition between different states about attracting foreign direct investment is going to lead to a business environment in terms of regulation, red tape, labor rules, land acquisition, and so on, that's going to become more constructive and attract a lot of investment through that channel. But I think that there is certainly a strong case that can be made that a country like India could be attracting a significant amount of the kind of lower value-added production that is moving out of China right now.
Yep.
And even not just low value added, over time, the entire global supply chain.
So there is actually good news on that front on the Indian side.
Yeah.
There has been movement. Last year and a half, the Prime Minister made a big push towards ease of doing business.
Yeah.
So some improvements on that front, more continuing underway. Labor law reforms actually have happened in several of the states. Not enough people seem to know about it, but at least 4 states have reformed their labor laws. Started with Rajasthan, followed by Madhya Pradesh, then Gujarat, and then Andhra Pradesh. And Gujarat actually has done something very creative, that in all these special economic zones and other different clusters that exist, what they have done on one particular law, which basically made it impossible to lay off workers under any circumstances. They have in these zones actually now amended the law such that regardless of the size of the firm, so previous restriction has been that if you are a firm with 100 workers or more, then you simply could not under any circumstances lay off workers. But now this has been in Gujarat particularly modified. Not only this, in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh they raised the limit to 300, but for special economic zones, etc., what they have done in Gujarat is that regardless of the size of the firm, as long as you pay 45 days worth of wages for every year worked, you can lay off workers. So it is about as flexible as you can ask for. So that has happened on land acquisition also. One of the states, Tamil Nadu, has done a reform. So under that, basically what they have done is to introduce a schedule into that central law, where they can list legislations that will be exempt from the 2013 Land Acquisition Act of the central government. So again, some progress there. I sort of see that certainly the mood is in that direction. There is also great movement on infrastructure. So the Prime Minister yesterday talked about it. The road construction has been the highest ever in 2015 and accelerating. The ports are doing a lot better. The Prime Minister also has actually a major program called Sagarmala, which is about the port-led development, based partly on his own experience of Gujarat, but I'm sure he's also familiar with the Chinese experience. So he certainly is also very keen, and port-led development, of course, means export-oriented development. Yep. So that is where hopefully he'll be expecting that, the Chinese manufacturers, etc., as they begin to move, would come into these areas which are closer to the ports, where they can then get their inputs fast and get their outputs fast out. So that is also very much in the cards. So I think we'll see some good news coming through. Those are my thoughts. Any concluding thoughts you would like to offer?
No, the only final thought will be that, of course, there are a number of global headwinds coming from the fact that global growth is anemic and there is slowdown of growth in China, in some emerging markets. Commodity prices are falling. The Fed is exiting zero policy rates. In spite of that, India has been able to still growing 7% plus. That's a positive. And there are some concerns in the business community that things are not as strong at the local level or at micro level as they are on the macro level. And I think that the key thing for India is to continue what they've been doing. First of all, macroeconomic stability and having the right macro policy, monetary, fiscal, and credit, and continue with the pace of reform. As long as that has been done, the potential growth of India could be much higher than 7%, going towards 8 or 9, or even more so. But that's all conditional on accelerating the key reform that we discussed so far.
Well, excellent. I think I'm delighted to hear your very optimistic outlook on India. For somebody who is known more pessimistically as Dr. Doom, I think we are very pleased that we have a very, very upbeat prognosis. Let me add, I personally have also taken a very optimistic view on this, and even though the global economy is very slow, not growing very fast, we should remember that between 1995 and 2013, OECD countries grew only about less than 1.5%. China still managed to grow so rapidly that during that period it went from less than $2 trillion to about $10 trillion today. So in the world market, even if it's not growing or growing slowly, it is a very large market. Today, the merchandise exports alone are about 18 trillion. Services exports are another 5 trillion. So if we actually stay on the reform path and do the right things for ourselves, I think the pie that exists is pretty large. Our current share is only 1.75% out of the 18 trillion in the merchandise exports and about 3% in the $5 trillion worth of services exports. So scope for India actually to expand is quite considerable, and as long as our reform process continues, I think we have reason to expect that we would, as I have been arguing, in the next 2 or 3 years, begin to touch double-digit growth. So I certainly see a very optimistic future. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.